In the days of empire, the British started to grow concerned about the number of cobras in India. So the governors came up with a simple economic remedy. Why don't we just offer a bounty for cobra hides? And that policy was a hit. In fact, it was so successful that enterprising Indians started to breed cobras just to get the bounty. Unsurprisingly, that caused a suspicious uptick in the number of bounties paid out, and finally the Brits clocked on, realised what was happening, and then they cancelled the scheme. Now, this posed a problem to the breeders. They now had all these worthless snakes. What do they do with them? So they chose to loose the surplus serpents back into the wild, causing the cobra population to surge beyond its previous levels, and of course completely defeating the point of the program. Almost every action we take introduces the risk of unintended consequences. Technology is no different. The cultural theorist Paul Virilio knew this well. In his famous words, he wrote, "When you invent the ship, you also invent the shipwreck." Every technology carries its own negativity, which is invented at the same time as technical progress. And oh boy, have we discovered those negativities in our field. We've served up countless examples of technology gone wrong. The press is now as likely to call technology a danger as it is to call it a saviour. Now, to be clear, these terrible mistakes were not intentional. They were the result of unintended consequences. But that doesn't mean that the industry gets to escape blame. There may well have been no malice involved here, but there was plenty of negligence. And unless this changes, this will hamper the growth of our field. Over the next 10 to 20 years, the tech industry is going to demand an enormous amount of trust from users. We will ask people to connect more and more of their lives to the products and the services that we build. We'll ask them to trust us with their homes, their vehicles, even the safety of their families. And the potential harms with emerging technology exceed the harms in technology even today. The stakes will only get higher with time. Algorithms could reinforce and cement bias in access to work, amenities, even justice. Surveillance systems could silently assemble the building blocks of totalitarianism. Automation could ravage the world of work, deepening inequality and upending our economies. It's time for our industry to take ethics seriously. And this has been my focus now for the last 3 years. So I'd like to talk about what I've learned along that journey, and then how we as a community of technologists can respond to the challenges ahead of us. Perhaps one of the most fundamental shifts in perception that we need to make is to recognize that technology is not neutral, and it never was. In 1980, the philosopher Langdon Winner wrote an essay, now a fairly famous essay, called "Do Artifacts Have Politics?" And Winner's conclusion was essentially, yeah, damn right they do. And he gave the example of Robert Moses. Robert Moses, some of you may know, was the chief architect, if you like, the main city planner of New York in the early and middle of last century. And Moses was a racist. We have ample evidence of his bigoted views. And Winner goes on to assert that Moses actually pushed his bigotry into the design of the metropolitan area of New York. We see here a bridge, quite a low bridge, in fact. We'll see it's just 9 foot high. And Winner's claim, at least, is that this was an intentional design decision to racially segregate certain parts of the city. Essentially what happens here is the only vehicles that can pass under a bridge this low are cars, low, sedans or whatever they might be. Buses, being double-decker, for example, tend not to be able to fit under these. So the impact this had was that black and minority residents who at the time were less likely to have access to private transport and had to travel more by bus, they simply were unable to pass under bridges like this. So Moses intentionally designed these low bridges over the parkways leading to Long Island so that minority residents of the city couldn't get access to those parts, to those lovely beaches. So even this structure, this inert, hulking structure of dozens of tons of concrete and steel and stone, Even something like a bridge can have a moral impact. So of course, the technologies that we build today, being so full of light and language and energy, of course they must have social and political and ethical impacts as well. And this makes sense because the world of technology is also the world of humans. We can't separate technical capabilities from human capabilities. These things act together. They become interwoven, hybrid actors. Moses' racist bridges show that things change what people can do and how they do it. So we have to abandon this belief that we just build neutral tools. We can't wash our hands of the social and ethical and political consequences of our choices. Now, to some people, that can be a bit of a tough sell. Technology, algorithms, and data itself are often seen as clean, neutral, objective things. Perhaps the most enduring ideology within the tech industry is that technologies have no ideology. But we know that's not the case. Professor Jeffrey Bowker coined this wonderful phrase: raw data is an oxymoron. All algorithms, all data carry the biases of the people and the cultures that collect, process, and present that data. Here you see a fantastic piece of information design done by Simon Scar for the South China Morning Post. And Scar has chosen a distinct metaphor, quite leading metaphor, of dripping blood to talk about or to convey the heavy human cost of the Iraq conflict. And as I say, I think this is a great piece of design. It's laden with meaning and connotation. On the right-hand side, we see exactly the same raw data with a completely different meaning. And this is by Andy Cotgrave, who works at Tableau Software. And he's transformed the meaning of the same raw data with just 3 changes. We've got a new color system, we've changed the hue of the diagram, we have a new headline at the top, and the diagram has been flipped on the vertical axis. This, for me, is elegant proof that we can introduce biases simply through the way that we structure, contextualize, and present data. Design, for me, is the application of ethics. Alan Chochinov has said that design is philosophy practiced with the hands. Now, sometimes that's an explicit relationship. If you're designing, for example, razor wire, whether you realize it or not, you're making a very powerful claim. You're saying that someone's right to private property is so important that we should injure someone who tries to contravene that right. But even if you're not making something as morally laden as razor wire or weapons, all design, and for that matter, all making, is really a statement about the future. We're making a claim for how we should interact with technology in the future, and then by extension, how we should interact with each other. And at the very same time, we're discarding thousands of different futures that could have otherwise come to pass if only we'd chosen those. So for me, there's a clear ethical component when we're doing nothing less than making a case for how we should all live. Now, in an ideal world, we want to get to a state where ethics becomes an ethos, a way in which we see the world around us, and a mindset that we bring to all of our work. But I also recognize that we have to start somewhere. There are fortunately concrete steps throughout the design and product development process where we can start to take our ethical responsibilities a little more seriously. Forgive the oversimplification of the design process. We, of course, know that it's rather messier than this. But right at the start of the project, when we're defining the projects we take on, we're analyzing the markets that we build for, we can set ourselves a proper ethical foundation for our work. Perhaps one of the critical choices within this phase is to rethink who we consider as a stakeholder for our work. Now, if you buy any MBA textbook, there will be a section in it about stakeholder analysis. And by this, they mean people who can affect your work. Usually peers, managers, superiors, partners, regulators, generally people in suits. But there's a second cohort of stakeholders that for too long we've overlooked. And that's people who can be affected by our work. If we look at Airbnb, for example, Airbnb is a very well-designed service. for precisely two groups of people. People who have some spare property that they want to rent out, and then people who want to rent that property. Unfortunately, the costs of that system, the pain points, the externalities, as they're sometimes called, are all felt by local residents. If you live next door to an Airbnb, you no longer have a neighbour. You have a new neighbour every couple of days, all of them dragging those wheelie suitcases over the cobbles at 4 a.m. They're not going to spend their money locally, they'll spend it mostly at the tourist traps. They're not interested in forming neighbourhood bonds. They will bring their own set of cultural expectations, if you like. And meanwhile, of course, rents are getting pushed up all throughout the neighbourhood as the appeal of the short-term profit of Airbnb grows. So we have to find a way to not just focus on users, but also to focus on the well-being of society. I think user-centricity, the idea of user-centered design, has caused us to become narrow, has caused us to become individualistic in our thinking. It really shouldn't just be about user needs, but the well-being of broader societies and even abstract concepts. If you work, for example, for Facebook, then there's a good claim that some of the work that's come out of your company over the last few years has started to threaten the fabric of democracy or the freedom of the press. We need to find ways to identify these values that we want to retain, we want to nurture in society, and find ways to bring those into our design process. One way we can do this is to focus on essentially eliminating harms or reducing harms. We can create what I call a persona non grata, essentially shedding light on the bad actors within a system. This is a dark persona, a persona noir, maybe a hacker or a troll or a terrorist. And this person can get the full persona treatment right. We give them a name, we can give them a face, and we can list out their motivations. But then our job as a project team becomes to hamper those individuals in everything that they try to do. And exposing them is an important part of treating that problem. When we come to generating ideas for how we want to tackle the problems ahead of us, we can build upon that preparatory ethical work and introduce some new techniques. I think it's very helpful to be precise when we talk about the language of ethics. Just because something was an unintended consequence, that doesn't mean that it was unforeseeable. It's more that more often we've not cared to look. We've disregarded the potential implications. But there are methods that exist for us to tease out what might be the second order or the third order effects of our work. Now, if you talk to a professional ethicist or an academic ethicist, they'll often try to get you to think about moral imagination. It's a phrase that they like to use. This is really about anticipating what might happen and then evaluating, well, who's that good for? What are the implications, the ethical values within that? The difficulty is that's sort of abstract, right? That's a thought experiment. I think that's easier to do if we have some kind of prompt, some vision that we can coalesce around and then have a conversation based upon. So I'm particularly interested these days in borrowing from the field of what's known as speculative design and creating a design fiction, or as I call it, a provocatype. Now this needs an example, so let me walk you through one. This is by Marcel Schoenaar and Han van Beek, who are two Dutch designers. And it's for some energy clients, I believe, gave them the project. And the scenario, the brief they were given is this. How might we plan charging infrastructure for electric vehicles in an era in a couple of decades where we don't have enough energy to go around? That's a pretty likely future, right? Electric vehicles are certainly going to take over. It's very likely there's going to have to be some charging infrastructure that's public for that. And it's also very likely that we're not going to have enough energy to go around in the coming years. So they built this provocatype to essentially walk through what that problem might look like in reality, how it might be solved, so that we can discuss whether that's the type of future we want. So here's how it works. And it's a 2-meter tall prototype. It's a big, heavy thing. And it starts at the bottom, and they've actually taken the cables from electric vehicles, and you pick one up and you plug it in. And we have lights around it that light up to say, well, okay, you're red, you're green, you're blue, so you know who you are within that system. Above it, we have ID card readers, RFID readers. So you take an ID card out, you tap it to authenticate with the system. Above that, then there are buttons. So we can twist these to request certain amounts of energy from the system. Perhaps I just need a short top up because I have errands to run. I just need 15 minutes and then I'm on my way. Or maybe I need a full charge, but I'm willing to wait longer because I've got to wait my turn for that. So we use these dials to request the energy that we want. And then above it, the rest of the device shows how the algorithm has prioritized those requests. So we have this sort of dot matrix display at the top. We have at the bottom, that's right now, we have red and blue, each getting a little bit of charge. Then later on, blue takes over, and then finally green gets all the charge available. You'll also notice that the energy bandwidth, we might call it, the amount of energy available is smaller at some times and wider at other times. This is, again, the algorithm predicting the amount of energy resources available in the coming hours. So this device helps to expose what an algorithmically driven world might start to look like in reality in, say, 20 years' time. But the most interesting thing for me here is the designers didn't stop there. They also designed these RFID cards, the cards that we're using to authenticate with the system. So people are given these cards that allocate them status within the system and quite possibly within society. Maybe we have a doctor in the middle there. This individual is given top priority in the system, but there's a caveat. You have to use this with discretion. You might be punished if you misuse that. Below that, we have a probation ID. This might be something that we give to a recent offender or someone awaiting trial. And their use is capped. They're maybe given lower priority within the system. So we see here how social status and potential inequality could be encoded and actually even reinforced through energy scarcity and through the IoT and the smart city. Now, the designers aren't proposing this as the right solution. They're not saying, start building this system in Rotterdam and Utrecht and wherever it might be. Instead, they've created a design that gets the right conversations happening. It's an artifact that kind of creates a wormhole between research and design. It's something that takes the ethical discourse away from an abstract thought experiment and gives us something concrete to say, well, do we want this? Is this the future that we want to head toward? Another important shift here is to change the way we think about ethics in this phase. Ethics is often seen as a drag, right? Something that is going to be obstructive, it's going to hamper innovation. But I like the phrasing from Peter Paul Verbeek, as a philosopher of technology at the University of Twente. And he says that ethics doesn't always have to oppose technology, but it should always accompany technological progress. So ethics should be something we infuse into our work and something that we see as a constraint. Now, any designers in the room, you know that the word constraint is slightly different than, or you see it differently, I suppose, than other people do. Designers know that constraints tend not to reduce the number of options. Well, yeah, sure, they'll reduce some, but they generate new options as well. So it's essentially about seeing ethics not just as a pair of shears snipping off harmful decisions, but it's also about seeing ethics as a seed of innovation, a positive, constructive force. When we move into the design phase proper, really we need to start challenging some of the preconceptions that might have started to creep in to our work. So many of the ethical dangers of technology stem from invisibility. People don't know what's happening inside their devices. And I think designers have to take a lot of the blame for this. We've had these mantras of simplicity. And so we've treated things like data as complexity, something that we sweep under the carpet, or we train the user not to lift the bonnet of their devices and see what's going on inside. Sometimes people say, well, the answer here is transparency. I actually think that's completely the wrong framing. If something's transparent, of course, you can't see it. I'm much more interested in talking about materializing something, bringing it into the visible spectrum. Moving things like data flows or algorithmic decisions. If we make those things visible, then people can make more informed choices about them. Probably the best example in modern tech is something like this. It's a energy monitor from a hybrid vehicle. I think this is the Prius, quite an old one. But what I like about this is it gives insight into a complex system of energy flow within a vehicle. Something that's always been, hidden even in some hybrid vehicles. And so you can learn how your driving style affects what's happening inside the machine. You learn if you accelerate sharply away from lights, then it starts to draw energy from the engine rather than the battery. And so by materializing this invisible resource, people can then act in more healthy and sustainable and ethical ways. So maybe we can take this kind of principle and apply it to digital technology, like home automation. So here's a speculative interface that I've done for some kind of smart home hub. The sort of thing that's starting to creep into the market now. It connects your home devices, your thermostats, whatever it might be. And maybe it also reads data from personal devices, locations, wearables, that sort of stuff. And perhaps in some future, maybe we get this device for free in exchange for seeing some adverts. So some information is passed to an ad panel based on what it learns or what it interprets about our interests. Now, we have a couple of systems a little bit like this now, but they're extraordinarily opaque. So we can try to apply this idea of making visible, of materializing the status of the system, communicating what's linked to what decisions are taken, how data is moving through the system. And maybe we end up with something like this snapshot. What I quite like about this presentation is it allows for true consent. If I see something on there I don't like, if I believe, well, actually, I don't want you to have access to this information, then I think I can just pluck it out. I swipe it or I remove it. And that gets us a lot closer to true data exchange, truly fair exchange of I know what I'm giving up and I know what I'm getting in return. Informed consent, something sadly that we're a long way away from in most modern technologies. Another design tenet that we often hear is this idea of don't make me think. I'm sure almost all of you will know that as the title of Steve Krug's bestseller. And of course, often it's true. We generally want to minimize the friction within our devices, within our interfaces. But it does come with a downside that sometimes it can take agency, it can take power away from the end user. So just sometimes that's a principle that's better being inverted. Sometimes we should make the user think and increase the friction within the things we build. Coming back to this same home hub system, here's an idea for how we might design an interface or a modal dialogue that has more friction within it. Because we're asking for pretty sensitive information here, right? We're asking for location, for biometrics, and so on. We also, I think, have some kind of obligation here to inform people that any anonymized data runs the risk of being re-identified later. If you have good algorithms or extra data sets to correlate with it, there's always that risk with any anonymized data. So I think we have a duty to let the user know here, so they really know what they're getting into. And I'm saying this is such an important decision they're taking that I'm going to defy classical usability theory. If I'm designing this to be as easy to use as possible, I want a big green button saying OK, but no, I'm going to force the user to take out a stylus or to use their finger and write the words I agree. Now, this will absolutely be more hassle for the user. This will absolutely convert a lot less than a nice, easy dialogue. But it builds genuine, true consent with a knowledge, as I say, of the value exchange that's happening between me and the system. And so it builds trust, and it reduces the risk of these things being rejected later, or maybe even us facing lawsuits or punitive regulation, because we conducted that relationship with respect from the ground up. Another idea that we can throw in here is what's called the veil of ignorance. This comes from John Rawls, who is a philosopher who wrote a book called A Theory of Justice. The idea of the veil of ignorance is fairly simple. A fair system is one designed as if we don't know our place in that system. So if I'm designing, say, a welfare program, if I apply this idea of the veil of ignorance, then a fair system, a fair welfare program would be, well, wherever I end up, if I'm a taxpayer, if I'm a welfare recipient, if I'm an administrator, wherever I end up in that system, I will look at it and say, yeah, I think I got a reasonable end of that deal. Really, it's about agreeing the rules of the game before we deal everyone's hands. So this is about stepping into the shoes of those stakeholders that we talked about at the start. The people who can affect our work, but the people who can be affected by our work. Seeing how they might see the decisions that we're about to take and making sure that their views are represented when it comes to our design and particularly our critique. And critique itself is so important to the ethical journey. And I think it's probably the easiest phase to start having these conversations. And here we can draw upon hundreds of years of ethical thought. One idea that I think is quite powerful is to appoint a designated dissenter. This is a concept I came across in Eric Meyer and Sarah Wachtabecha's book, Design for Real Life. And I haven't found a better way to describe this role other than to say it's kind of a constructive pain in the arse. You're there to be an antagonist, to role play as someone who objects to the team's assumptions. So throwing in these little grenades of defiance into the design process. Let's say, a trivial example, we've got a system that asks for marital status. Well, if I'm a designated dissenter, maybe I'll role play and say, if I'm going through a horrible divorce, then why are you making me go through this? I don't want to have to talk about my marital status with some, kiosk. So throwing in these little challenges, I suppose, in an attempt to change how we consider these risks. It's also particularly important at this stage that we find a way to talk more rigorously about ethics. We all have hunches, we all have moral intuition, if you like, about what's wrong and right. But there are proper ways that have been handed down through generations to evaluate ethics. So I try to distill these into what I call 4 ethical tests. These are derived from the 3 main schools, if you like, of modern ethics. So let's go through them. The first test we can apply. What if everyone did what I'm about to do? Would a world in which this was a universal law of behavior, would that be a better place or a worse place? This is an idea that goes all the way back to Immanuel Kant. It's what's known as a deontological theory of ethics. And a deontologist tends to believe they have some kind of moral duty, that we have an obligation to behave in particular ways. There's kind of almost a set of rules that we need to apply. So let's try and apply this question to, again, a fairly simple tech example, say a dark pattern. We all know dark patterns, intentionally deceptive interfaces that try to trick people into behaving certain ways, usually to our advantage. So if I have someone asking me to put a dark pattern in my product, and I'd hesitate to throw my product manager friends under the bus here, but it's definitely going to be a product manager. If they want me to ship a dark pattern, then how do I respond? Well, I can use this ethical test. What if everyone did what I'm about to do? If everyone shipped every dark pattern that they were asked to do or that they saw they could, it's pretty obvious what would happen to our technologies. We'd start to trust them less. We would withdraw from the sphere of technology. We'd say it's corrupt and crooked and generally not want to engage with it anymore. So that gives us ammunition, at least, to say this feels ethically like something that might be a wrong turn. The second ethical test we might apply. Am I treating people as ends or as means? This also comes from Immanuel Kant. But this probably needs a little bit of unpacking. When I look at this question, what I see is really we're asking about how we're treating users. Are we treating them as free individuals with their own goals? Or am I treating them really as a way for me to hit my own goals? Now, I don't think this is a question that any one of us individually would struggle with. But I do see data-driven companies beyond a certain size really start to wrestle with this question and end up with the wrong answer. Because in a lot of these larger data-driven organizations, the way people talk about users starts to slowly shift over time. No longer are they the raison d'etre, or the reason that we're there. Instead, they start to become experimental subjects, means for us to hit our own targets. And essentially, when that happens, we're no longer seeing people, we're seeing masses. And whenever you start to make that shift away from individuals to masses, unethical design is just around the corner. A third ethical test we can offer. Am I maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people? And by extension, then, am I minimizing suffering, minimizing harm? And this is known as a utilitarian view on ethics. And a utilitarian isn't really interested in having certain moral rules and laws and obligations and duties. Instead, they care about impacts, they care about the consequences. So it's sometimes called a consequentialist view on ethics. And this feels slightly promising, right? The tech industry, I think, quite enjoys thinking about things in this way because it feels a bit measurable. And there are people who now think we can have a scientific answer to morality. We can put people in MRI scanners, we can do the skin response thing and see how their brains and bodies respond to certain ethical decisions. And then that, if true, would tell us sort of scientifically how we need to act. Now, put it this way, I'm not a big fan of those methods, but there's certainly a growing interest in trying to calculate ethics essentially through this equation. But of course, that contains the very problem with the utilitarian perspective. Do we really have to do this for every single decision we take? Isn't this just going to turn us into a series of number crunchers, just calculating the ups and downs of everything that we do? And it also runs into problems with what's sometimes called the tyranny of the majority. If we have a 99% majority of a population wants to exile or to execute a 1% minority, well, if you're a utilitarian, at least that door is still open for that conversation to happen. If you're a deontologist, you say, well, no, that's wrong. We will not do that. But it sometimes means that utilitarians can end up having to argue for some fairly counterintuitive decisions. The final ethical test that we can apply. Would I be happy for this to be a front page story? And this is grounded in this third pillar of modern ethics, which is called virtue ethics. Virtue ethicists don't really care about duty and obligation, nor do they really care about the impacts and the consequences. Instead, they care about character, the moral identity of the individual. So how do I want to live? What are the values and the virtues that I want to live by? And then am I actually doing that? Am I actually showing those through the decisions that I take? So really, this is a question about accountability, right? Would I sign my name to the decisions that I'm about to take? So it speaks at the core of our identity, which has to be an important part of moral reasoning. Again, maybe there's a downside. If I'm only choosing to act a certain way because I'm scared I'll be embarrassed if word gets out, then that doesn't feel like proper ethical action. If I'm only avoiding something because people would criticize me for it, I'm sure Immanuel Kant would certainly object. We should, of course, also take time to test whether the assumptions that we've made are correct, whether the impacts of our technologies are quite as positive as we hope. We can take measures to analyze our systems on a quantitative, mathematical basis. We can analyze training data sets for machine learning systems and so on. We can analyze them for bias. We can audit algorithms to make sure that they are producing as fair results as they can. This is something that Kate Crawford, who's a researcher and machine learning specialist, calls fairness forensics. But of course, any quantitative techniques are generally better if we pair them with qualitative techniques. So conducting field research is so important here. Seeing the real effects of our decisions among a wide range of individuals. Because who better to be a designated dissenter than someone who has every reason to dissent? So this, for me, is about getting people testing our provocatypes, our betas, our products, and getting that happening early before the potential harms of our decisions go loose on a wide population. Sadly, because of the way that technologies and humans intersect, as I mentioned at the start, the harms of technology fall most often upon society's most vulnerable people. So it's our duty, I think, to understand these communities better, to bring representatives of those groups, to bring their activists and so on into the design studio, into the tech company, so that we can start to build services that really prioritize their needs and avoid harms. Underpinning all of this, we need to create what I would call ethical infrastructure, essentially some kind of company-wide resilience to help us make better ethical decisions. Diverse teams, of course, have an important role to play here. This is sometimes a politicized issue these days, but I obviously don't apologize for bringing it up. Decisions made by groups of people who are largely the same will, of course, tend to overlook the harm that decision could do on a bunch of other people who are different. So making sure that you have both inherent and acquired diversity within your team can help to inoculate you against that risk. It can reduce the risk of you making harmful decisions. If you're lucky enough to be a leader within your team, then you can help to set the right expectations about the sorts of ethical behaviors you want. My old boss at Twitter, Mike Davidson, had a saying, which I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but something along the lines of, if you just reward the results, you'll get all sorts of behaviors. But if you reward the right behaviors, you'll usually get the right results for free. So it's about making it clear what sort of behaviors you want at, say, different levels within the organization. What moral difference should there be, if any, between a vice president and a junior designer, for example, and making sure that everyone realizes that ethics is part of that role, part of the responsibility that we expect from you. And we might choose to codify that through something like core values. Core values sometimes get a lot of stick. Often, really, they're just some lip service is paid to them. But when they are well defined and fully adopted by an organization and by the employees, these become powerful ethical tiebreakers, if you like, because they have senior support. If we're struggling with a difficult question, we can fall back on our core values for guidance. Now, sometimes this does take us into the realm of politics. Tech workers are finally seeing that they have a lot of collective power. Although we may be individually quite weak, when we band together, we can achieve significant things. Look at what's happened particularly at Google, but now around Amazon. They've got a group of employees mobilizing around climate change, for example. So we shouldn't forget our collective power. We may be individually weak, but as I say, between us, collectively we're expensive, we're hard to replace, and if we lift our hands off the keyboard, then nothing gets built. We shouldn't overlook the power that gives us. Now, the tech industry is now getting targeted politically from both wings, and that pressure is going to increase with time. There is absolutely going to be more regulation in our field in the next 10 years. So we probably have a duty to actually get involved in that process. No one, not even the most pedantic bureaucrat, wants bad regulation. But we know sometimes that politicians don't understand the nuances of technology. So we have a duty, I think, to advise them to get involved in that process. When there are policies going out for consultation and so on, we need to do our bit there. Now, ultimately, change comes through practice, though, rather than theory. Morality is a muscle that needs exercise. The choice to live well is just that. It's a choice. It's not some abstract quality that gets bestowed on some lucky people. It comes from asking ourselves difficult questions. How might I be screwing up in the work that I'm doing every day? What would my limit be? How would I know when and how to push back on a request that I think is unethical? Ethical change does require some kind of systemic focus, but it is also an individual choice to stand up for what's right. Now, we have to recognize, of course, that can be risky. That requires privilege. Not everyone has the ability or the needs or the circumstances to be able to stand up for that kind of change. But I will say this: if you feel comfortable and safe and respected in your team, in your company, in your industry, then you are in the perfect position to use up a little bit of that goodwill to stand up for what you think is correct. Now, that can be difficult and emotionally draining work. It becomes easy to punish yourself for your own mistakes and ethical inconsistencies. But the good news, and what I choose to cling to through all of this work, is that taking this journey is really the only way to help bring us closer to being the kind of person that we really want to be. But because it's difficult, it does mean we have to draw upon each other. Given the challenges of the future, we're going to need all the thoughtful technologists that we can get, people who care enough to make a difference in this crucial industry of ours and who want to help to navigate it toward better futures. I dearly hope that you will choose to be one of these people. So I have written a book about this called Future Ethics. I have just a couple of copies if anyone's interested in buying one at the end. But sales pitch over. Thank you for your time.
Wasn't that incredible? Oh my God. I did have a little tear in my eye. This is actual tears. This has set the interwebs ablaze, this one has. And we've got some questions. The first one is a very practical one. It's from Anonymous. I'm about to start an ethics and values survey in a company of about 100. Do you think this is a good way to establish a common set of ethics and values?
I don't fully know what's involved in that survey, but it sounds like it. I mean,
That's good.
If you're taking the ethical temperature of an organization, let's say, you start to have that conversation as early as you can about, well, what do we actually believe in? What company do we want to be part of? And is that reflected in the choices that we take? That has to be an important part of it. Ideally, you'd probably have done it before you get to 100 people. But I know what startups are like. You know, you generally won't make space for that kind of stuff until you get to a certain size. So yeah, that sounds like a very good, healthy step.
That's wonderful. Whoever's doing that sounds amazing. Yeah, go ahead and do this kind of thing. Right. It sounds great. It's good that someone's doing that. That's wonderful. Do you have any examples of core values or arriving at them?
Twitters were great, actually. Yeah. And you can find them if you Google hard enough. They're sort of private, but they're not very private. And I could probably still recite them. I know 9 of them. I'm not going to attempt that now, but there's certainly quite a few have just stuck with me, and they were frequently used. In fact, as part of the new hire orientation, you got given a laptop sticker with, you know, whatever core value, and you chose the one you thought was best and you popped it on your laptop, and you started to expose those to the rest of the team. And those really did get relied upon. If we were, you know, at loggerheads over a decision, we say, okay, well, we recognize that people and personalities matter. That was one of them. So how do we use that to help navigate that problem? And so, yeah, I think at Twitter, they really worked.
Okay. I've got a good follow-on one here. I think I might have to sit down to do this. It's a little bit freaking me out, this one. How do you square stories then of how seriously Twitter looks for the right behaviours with it being a platform for effectively distributing hatred?
God. I don't work at Twitter. I haven't for 4 years. Ask that to a current Twitter employee. I'm not interested in getting into that.
Good. Right. Okay. Excellent. Right. I'm going to skip the one about us. Should we boycott Twitter? I think, given the context of that answer, but that does lead to a broader one, which is it even possible to push ethics of this kind, given that we live under a system of capitalism that does not allow it to happen?
I generally try to keep my politics out of these kind of talks because I don't want to be easily dismissed as just some political ranter. That is a very legitimate question, however. On ethical decisions within businesses stem from the profit imperative. And there are some organizations that have followed the doctrine that the only purpose a business had is to make profit. There's a whole Chicago school branch of economics founded upon that. I think that was an ethical misstep, let's put it that way. And I think those organizations make it very hard to have an ethical conversation. You can still have business case justifications for ethics, but ultimately you lose that conversation. So I think there are good questions to be asked about it. I share some skepticism about it, for sure. I also recognize that there are political activists who are better equipped to handle those types of challenges and to agitate for change there. I do what I can within the bounds of what I have, which is a tech audience. And I trust that the right people in the right places are also asking the bigger questions about our political systems.
Okay. Turn it on, that's better. I think that's absolutely summed everything up then. This is incredible. I think we can all go and do our part as the takeaway message from this. We can all go and make the world a little bit better Let's go do that. So let's give a huge round of applause, please, for Kenneth.
Thank you.